Welcome to the Disruptance Podcast. The Disruptance Podcast is the show that disrupts the way entrepreneurs think to make them more profitable and impactful. Rethink tired and outdated business norms to welcome innovation and unlock your unlimited possibilities. Here are your hosts, Forney and Greg Fowler.
All right, Eric. So I want to jump into this. We were having a conversation the other day, and I think this is going to be, really exciting for anybody who's tuning into this episode here. Looking at it from a standpoint, and you were really diving deep into this. You said most advice is bad advice, and there really isn't any context, right? There's no personability to it. So let's talk about that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, one of the things that I find is that whenever you go to a conference or whenever you go to a convention, what you find is most people will stand on stage and they'll pontificate about whatever makes their ego look best. And what they haven't done most of the time is any real scientific like testing, right? There hasn't been a lot of A/B testing. That's because we only get to live our life one direction. And so what I find is that most people will give advice to an audience of people, and either they'll neglect to include the fact that it's not profitable, or they'll neglect to include the fact that they've only been doing it for a few months, or they'll neglect to tell you that the reason why it works is because of one really talented person. And so I believe that that most advice is not worth listening to if it's not rooted solely in principles. And so I think of it this way, Greg, that goes, regardless of what religious construct that you subscribe to, they have fundamental texts and principles that have survived multiple centuries, multiple millennia, and you look at the principles that survive in spite of whatever religion it is. You just look at the book of Buddhism, and I think it's 7,000 or so years old. Principles incredibly applicable still to this day. Same thing with Christianity and with any other religion, right? Insert whatever your religion flavor of choice is, but you look at it and they're rooted in fundamentals. And so very rarely does someone talk about advice that's grounded in some degree of fundamental principles.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, Eric, and anybody who's tuning in, obviously, to Disruptance here, with us, it's time and time again advice to learn from others, take advice from the people who have been there, done that, bought the t-shirt, much further where you want to go. But I think that's a really solid point that you mentioned, is to, where they are today isn't where they were 10 years ago. Where you're sitting right now taking that piece of advice from a true pro, you're not taking into account their entire past and their journey to get there. So I hear what you're saying there. Let's talk about the context and the principle. So to advise the audience, if you're going to take advice from somebody, how do you do it? How do you approach it? Where's your head at that way?
That's a great question. That, I think, becomes one of the difficulties, is that a lot of times what you don't realize is that you've taken bad advice and you've acted on it. And and so then determining was the execution the problem, or was the strategy the problem? That can be one of the most difficult things to understand. And so the way that I've approached this is by subscribing to mental models. And if you think about what a mental model is, it's one of the most unsexy topips to discuss. But the reason
that's why we're bringing it here, Eric. Right? That's why we're talking about it.
Exactly. But the reason why mental models is because you want to think of it as this way that you view the world through timeless and tested principled frameworks that at a minimum get you a desired outcome. And so one of the ways to think about, like, trying to contextualize this a little bit better is that if you're gambling, which, do as you wish, but not one of my favorite choices. I hate to lose money, and so I can't stand to gamble. But there are times that you can gamble and you can make money and you can win. And you can do so as a result of bad choices. Wow. So bad choices can get you a good outcome. And by the same token, good choices can get a bad outcome. Trying to differentiate between good choices with bad outcomes and bad choices with good outcomes is incredibly difficult.
Mm.
And so, as a guy who specializes in marketing, Greg, I mean, how you would do this, I assume, in the marketing world, right? Is you A/B test, or you run even more letters of the alphabet in order to understand, was it just the activity, or was it the message? Was it the medium? What is it that actually generated my desired result? And is it something that I can duplicate?
Wow. I really like the way that you're breaking that down, Eric, and to bring it home to the real estate professional that may be tuning into this, or the entrepreneur. From your perspective, how are you, bringing that to your team, the professionals that you've trained and teach at the highest of levels, for them to really A/B test, right?
Yeah.
To split, to see what's effective for their highest and best uses of time and what isn't. Again, taking your advice, which you've been there, done that, bought the t-shirt, but then you have the understanding that you got to put it in their perspective at their time in their career. How are you managing those expectations? How are you guiding them down that road?
Yeah. Well, first, what you have to understand is that emotion rarely ever gives you a desired outcome. Right. So we have to operate instead first from a framework of choosing to be rational. Now, you could choose to be rational and understand that people are irrational and emotional.
There you go.
But you, as the decision maker, as a leader, as the entrepreneur, still has to operate from a place of ration and reason, because you have to make clear decisions in a way in which gets you a desired outcome. Now, one of the principles could be, is, if you think about it from a real estate standpoint, is that people will take action emotionally in real estate. And so one of those principal frameworks can be, is that you need to then understand that we oftentimes, as real estate agents or in the real estate profession, work with some of the best people at the worst time, or some of the best people at their worst.
Wow.
And when you understand that that's the framework that you operate from, then you can make decisions that allow you to be more rational in order to help get the customer what they want. And so one of the questions that I often will ask our agents or anyone in the organization is, okay, what does the customer want? And it sounds like a stupid, meaningless question, I understand. However, I'm always amazed by how difficult how difficult it is for people to articulate that answer. And very rare. And so then whatever they tell me, almost always my immediate follow-up question is, how do you know that?
Ooh, great question.
And if the answer is not because they told me, then what I understand is that you're operating from your own bias. You're operating from your belief system of how you would want the transaction, or from how you believe the consumer would want the transaction to be. And instead of actually understanding by getting it directly from the consumer what they want the desired outcome to be. And so I strip it down to kind of the most fundamental first principles of it, which is, what are the things that are true always? What is always true? And I love the best first principles thinking example that always comes to my mind is Elon Musk. And so one of the things that we'll do as a team is we'll quarterly actually teach thinking. And we'll teach thinking models, and it's incredibly unsexy. I enjoy it, but very rarely does anybody get excited to discuss it. But one of the things that I love, and whether it's true or not, I don't know. But Elon Musk was always told that you couldn't have an affordable electric car, and you could only get electricity that was battery operated at a certain kilowatt hourly rate. And the reason for that was because at the time there were no battery suppliers who would sell you that amount of electrical charge for less than X number of dollars per kilowatt hour. And so what Elon did was he kind of stripped, at least this is how the story goes, is that he strips it down then to first principles. That goes, okay, well then what is a battery? Well, a battery is just elements. Okay, well then how much would it cost if I just bought those elements on the commodity exchange?
Okay.
And so he takes a totally different approach, but whereas everyone told him you can't buy power that cheap, it was because you couldn't buy power in its like completed battery state for the price that he had a desire to buy it for. But what wasn't true was that you couldn't actually get the components of batteries to cost that amount of money. And so that was one of the big differentiators, the story goes, as far as Tesla being able to have a lower cost and market share around electric cars. He applies the same fundamental process of thinking then to rockets, to SpaceX, which was the idea that you couldn't relaunch and reuse a rocket.
Wow.
And he actually drew what his vision for reusable rockets looked like on a flight home from Russia when when Russians wouldn't sell him rockets at the price that he was willing to pay for them. And his entire framework was from the idea of first principles thinking, because first principles are always true. Then once we understand what is always true, then we can work up and make, somewhat scientific based decisions from there. And I realize that science is not a sexy topic for entrepreneurs. So let me try to make it more sexy, which is, it's nothing more than saying that we go out and we test something, we measure the result, and then we reflect on the result. That's it, right? Is that we test, we measure, we reflect, test, measure, reflect. And that's what every business should look like. I believe that that's how we should operate life in general. Is if you, as a diabetic, Greg, you test your blood sugar, and then you have to reflect on the impact of something that you consumed or an activity that you took. And then you have to begin to build this mental model to where I imagine today it's way less taxing to be diabetic than it was when you started.
100%. It's evolved and changed with technology and health and science that way. And it's interesting that you mentioned these things though, Eric. And as I'm kind of unpacking a lot of this information, the adage that I always kind of come to grips with is not assuming anything and really asking the right questions to determine the proper answer so that you can execute. And as you're mentioning these things, what pops into my head is you and I are sitting at, a park, and we're looking across the way and we see a gentleman sitting on a bench, and we're going back and forth with one another, pretending to guess what he's going to have for lunch. Instead of one of us just getting up, walking over and asking, "Hey, sir, sorry to bother you. We just got a quick question for you. Kind of weird. What are you going to eat for lunch?" He lets us know. Instead of guessing and assuming, you go straight to the source. And I think for an entrepreneur looking at your clientele, who's been there, done that, going to the advisory portion, who's really seen the successes that you're looking to accomplish into your life and into your business, and then ask them the proper questions, right? What have you seen with the ideal clientele that we're trying to engage with? What are their needs, wants, desires? How can we position ourselves? How can we ask the right questions, making sure that we're delivering the product and service that they really want and need? If you don't have those answers yourself. Now, if you've been doing the business for a long time, like you have, Eric, you've been there, you can take that A/B or split testing, reverse engineer it and say, hey, we've been doing this a long time. These are our ideal client avatars. This is how we've been able to articulate our message and our brand to connect and do our business at the highest, best levels. This is what we're finding. But it's that continual work. It's not you set it and forget it, like the crummy infomercials that we've all seen over time. Set it and forget it. It's constantly moving forward with the work and repositioning. Put it to the market, get feedback, really bring that up a notch, and then bring it back. It's that never-ending cycle. So I love everything that you're saying. I think it's massively important to know where you're coming from. This is sound advice, truly is.
Well, it's interesting. This morning I was listening to a podcast, and I'd not heard this said before, and it really made me stop to think whether I thought this was accurate or not. And it's not business advice, but I thought it was an interesting example of this idea that most advice is bad. And so I was listening to this Michael Jordan autobiography, and Sam Perkins, who was a long-term NBA player, said that Michael had a lot of luck. That Michael Jordan had a lot of luck during his career, and when I first heard that, I got this like defensiveness about it, where I'm like, the hell he did. And then, Sam went on to say that Jordan had a lot of luck because he had great coaches. and that because of the situations that he found himself into, or because of a couple of decisions, that Jordan became Jordan that we know him to be. And so I really had to like kind of decide if I wanted to believe that was true or not, because luck is this interesting thing, Greg, where once we introduce this concept of luck, people oftentimes stop taking your advice as sound advice. Or entrepreneurs, once you introduce this concept of luck, they oftentimes get really defensive. And it almost always boils down to this defensiveness around the idea of how hard someone works.
Mm-hmm.
As if somehow having a few lucky breaks negates all of your hard work. That's not how it works, but that's how the like arrogance of entrepreneurship shows up. And so, when you look at Jordan, and you see what his kind of this pattern of luck, it was that, in college, his coach was Dean Smith, winning this NCAA coach at the time. And then, he had Bobby Knight, who was his Olympic coach when he was competing in as a college kid. He then went on to have Doug Collins and Phil Jackson, and then as also had Chuck Daly, the '92 Dream Team, and so you look and you go, well. Oh, and Tex Winter, who was his offensive coordinator with the Bulls, and then Tim Grover as his fitness and athletic conditioning coach. And so you look at all these coaches and you're like, you can't argue against the point that yes, he had a lot of amazing coaches. Mm-hmm. Now, is that precisely what made Jordan Jordan? We don't know. There's no ability to say if that was what made Michael. So then you go, okay, well, we can't eliminate that as a variable. So what are the fundamental time-tested, always true principles of advice that we could take by studying Michael's career? And those things separate themselves in spite of whoever the coach was. Mm-hmm. Michael showed up and treated practice at 100%, arguably even greater than 100%, right? I mean, his teammates hated him in practice because of how intense he was and the level of discipline and execution that he expected everyone around him to carry themselves to. Okay, you may not choose to apply that same methodology. That might have been what got Steve Jobs fired the first time at Apple, right? But it's a principle. Then you get to decide, do you want to adhere to that principle or not? Michael put a ton of emphasis on self-work. He got beat up by the Detroit Pistons, and then he goes in the offseason and adds something like 15 pounds of muscle, comes back and is a totally different Michael Jordan, changes the way that he approaches the game. Phil Jackson gets him to change the way he approaches the game mentally. Phil taught him that even when you get knocked down to the court, you get back up and you get up with composure, right? You don't let the other team see you emotional. That's a principle, right? That applies whether or not you're Michael Jordan or whether you're Michael at Dunkin' Donuts. It makes no difference. It's a fundamental time-tested principle that, funny enough, Phil Jackson actually adopted from Buddhism, right? Is this practice of meditation that he brought into the Bulls, that I think is interesting. So as an entrepreneur, to tie kind of a bow on it, is you are looking for things that are always the right thing to do in spite of the variables. And so what is always the right thing to do? Convenience. Right? It's my belief that always and forever that humans will desire to make everything in life as convenient as humanly possible. Like people have been in love with the idea of time travel for as long as time itself, because it would be far more convenient than packing up the Conestoga on the Oregon Trail, is just to time travel your way there instead, right? And so we believe that convenience is a time-tested principle. Jeff Bezos says that customers will always want more selection, and that customers will always want it at the lowest price. They'll always want it as fast as humanly possible. I mean, I just had an electrical outlet or something like an extension cord delivered within 4 hours Why? Because I could, and not because I needed it necessarily. I mean, yeah, sure, it was convenient, but
Sure.
if I had to wait another day, it wouldn't matter. And so I think about it then instead, Greg, is you work backwards and go, well, what won't change?
Mm.
What in your business won't change? Because if you think about it, and we'll like, unpack a little bit about how much your business has changed.
Yep.
In the last 15 years or so, you've been doing what amounts to be marketing, social media, content creation for entrepreneurs. A lot has changed in that realm. And yet I'm guessing your business looks way different today than it did 15 years ago. But
Sure.
the fundamental principles probably haven't changed. Am I right?
You're correct.
So what stayed the same?
It's the people aspect.
Okay.
The end user. It's interesting because the clientele in and of itself is not in that nature. It's the end user. It's really that connectivity that you have with the marketplace and being able to evoke an emotion and connect in a meaningful way in a memorable standpoint, so that when your brand, product, or service is perceived as needed and or wanted, that you're top of mind.
Yeah.
And so I going to the fundamental principles, as you mentioned, Eric. I find it to be fascinating into this dialogue. I always push back on the luck sort of mentality, into, and I know a lot of other entrepreneurs will do the same thing. It's that old adage, the harder I work, the luckier I get, or it ends up being, preparation meets opportunity equals luck. Depending on who you talk to, some people are a little bit more sore about it than others. I think that there's a little bit of magic that's out there, not to be corny or cliche, but I think that massive amounts of continuous action and preparation, hard work and determination and stick-to-itiveness, driving down the right path, doing the right activities will eventually afford you the outcome of your desires in a positive way. So I think the harder someone works and smarter in tandem, right, in the right direction, the luckier they are. Luckier they get and perceive to the end user. And this is, again, going to your basketball adage with Michael Jordan. I guess personally, as much as I love Michael Jordan, I probably love Michael at Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts a little bit better because he's always fueling me up there. But big shout out to you, Michael, if you're out there listening. Right. But I find that to be, fascinating that people like to look at the pinnacle and what the overall outcome, the highlight reels, the 80s montage that you see in a movie sort of scenario. And very few people want to take the time to reverse engineer and dissect what it really took to get them there. And I think that's the hard work that we've been talking about in the continuous nature. The coaches, the trainers, the mentors that are in our lives, I find that to be massively important. And I would push back on you, Eric, whether you're feeling one way or another about this, but I do feel that everything that you mentioned about Michael Jordan, it shaped him.
Yeah.
He was not born this way. None of us are born this way. We have certain fundamental principles that our situation is designed, and we're making conscious decisions every single day of what we're trying to accomplish with our lives. That's how I believe it. So, anybody feel differently, please jump in, the DMs, the comments. We want any engagement that way. But how do you feel about that, Eric? I mean, you had brought it up. I mean, you're there, you hit the highest of highs. You know what this looks like, the peak of the mountain. Do you feel like you were born this way? Do you feel like Eric Forney's Eric Forney? Not to do a contrast to Michael Jordan and Eric Forney, but I guess I will.
I think there's a part of me that says yes, and I think that there's some nuance and gray to it. You look at it and you go, I just look at some other examples, and Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett grew up like a block away from each other. Mm-hmm. Is Warren Buffett individually is incredibly successful? Is Warren Buffett without Charlie Munger as successful as he is today? No. The two of them together make them the greatest investing pair in human history. And so there is, I think, this interesting component where I kind of wrestle with this idea of like, and we don't have to go down this rabbit hole, but like, there is this controversial idea as well about the idea of like, being born in America, we do have these interesting abilities to have access and exposure and privilege that not everyone has access to, and that shapes undeniably some level of success. And so, I think that there's always this level of control this span of control that we all have, and I think we can always improve that. To imply that, I don't know. This is an interesting philosophical question. I'm struggling with this idea around that. I don't know if there is a right answer. Because what I don't want a listener to do is to go, what Eric said, that my natural abilities and natural talent and who I am have a ceiling to it, and therefore I've hit my ceiling and I quit. I'm taking my ball and going home, because it's not what I'm saying. In fact, having spent enough time with Gary would even said recently, right? You reach this ceiling of your potential, and then you decide to start being purposeful. How hard are you going to work at breaking through that ceiling of achievement in order to get better at something that you weren't naturally world-class talented and amazing at? And so there are these all of us have a level of limitations. There are some things that we cannot do. I believe no matter how hard I try, I will not be an NBA player. And so as a direct byproduct of that, there are limitations to life. And they are far fewer limitations to life than most of us believe.
Well
and
said.
most of us let get in our way.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that there is an argument with a serendipitous nature, right, of life. And I would always caution duality. I think that that's important. One person's perspective or opinion, there's somebody who believes just as strong, if not stronger, on the complete opposite.
Yeah.
So I think that ultimately anybody who's tuning into Disruptance and really seeking to grow, to scale, to learn from perspective of people who really care. I mean, we're here, Eric. I mean, that we're not doing this for because we have nothing better to do. I mean, ultimately, we're trying to make impact on people's lives and guide and share, and give, and ultimately just spark conversation, which I think is very meaningful for all of us to be doing. I love this episode. I think this was incredible, man. Do you have any closing thoughts? Anything you want to address before we jump off here, Eric? I mean,
it's interesting. I don't know why when I was listening to you, I was just thinking of there's a guy that I interviewed on the other podcast that I host, the Living podcast. Mitch Johnson is his name, and Mitch manages Gary Keller's Gary's money. Let's just call it that. I'm sure there's a technical term, but it's Gary's money. And when you get to understand Mitch, one of the things that is so interesting and influential, Mitch, I think, has lost a total of like $2,400 in the entire time that he's managed Gary's money. He can tell you down to the penny.
Wow.
And one of the things that's interesting, though, is that one of the principles that I took away from my conversation with him was that Mitch carries around a journal. And in that journal, he writes every deal that he looks at. He writes down, the terms and what his mental model and thought process is for that deal. And then he goes back and he reflects: was it a good decision or a bad decision? Right? What does that win-loss look like? Why did he make the decisions that he made? And did it result in the outcome that he believed that it would? So he's actually, doing this idea of testing, measuring, reflecting. And so what I thought about that is like the level of focus and intensity and commitment to getting it right every time is unparalleled. You looked at almost 1,000 investment opportunities before taking action on the very first one. Most of us won't do anything 1,000 times, especially do it 1,000 times for free.
Right.
And yet Mitch did. And so then you go, well, then let me go back and understand a little bit about what does that person think who's willing to look at 1,000 deals before they pull the trigger on one. And what you find is that, Gary just so happened to walk into a ski chalet club, and Mitch had gotten a real estate license 2 days before. And Gary wanted to buy this, condo at this ski resort. and a couple $1 million. And just so happened that Mitch is standing there. He's out of license for due days. Gary Keller teaches him how to write a real estate contract, buys a $2 million property from him. That's luck. Okay. That's just totally could have been anyone else, right? But it's Mitch. Now, the difference between luck and then taking doing something meaningful to change the trajectory of his life starts here. Is every single week for 4 years, and sometimes several times a week, Mitch would call, text, or email Gary, asking him for advice on his real estate business, begging him to get into the room to get into what was Gary's top 100 at the time, to hear what the conversations and discussions were happening with the top real estate entrepreneurs in the world. And so for 4 years, Mitch asked him if he could get access to be in the room to hear that. Eventually, Gary said yes. Now, it took 4 years of consistent asking, right? But this is a guy who took a situation of luck and transferred luck to persistence and life trajectory changing action. And so as a byproduct of that, then he continued to show up as consistent, predictable. Gary then gave him little bit by little additional opportunity to prove himself before eventually giving him the opportunity to manage his portfolio of wealth. And that's been a really great decision for both of them. And so, I think that we should acknowledge that sometimes life just hands us this amazing opportunity. What we do with it after that is our decision. And how do we show up? How do we act? And how consistent are we willing to be after we make that decision, given the opportunity that life gives us? How many times does that happen? Not very many in life. And, and so you probably only get 5, 6, 7 opportunities like that in any point in our life. And so here's Mitch, a guy who takes the opportunity and then absolutely maximizes it for everything that it's worth, which I love, because it really encompasses that duality that you spoke of.
I think that's a beautiful example of that, Eric. And the preparation ahead of time, meeting the opportunity, and then executing. And I think ultimately that's where people really need to kind of take that away. And hopefully it's resonated with everybody who's tuning in. It really is the amount of effort and time. The war is won before the battle begins. The championship is won before you even step foot on the court. And it really is that preparation, meeting the opportunity and seizing those moments, and that happenstance or serendipitous nature or luck, whatever you want to call it. But the only thing I can say is, Eric, I'm lucky hanging out with you every week and doing this, and it's an absolute pleasure, my friend. To really just provide this knowledge to the community out there and who we serve. It's awesome, man. I appreciate it.
Thanks, buddy. You too.